So it's always quite a big deal when an enduring scientific theory of reality or explaining an aspect of reality is overturned. But this is part of how science works. It continues to investigate, willing to dispose of formerly held views in exchange for things that more accurately describe reality, and in the case of neurobiology, allow us to influence reality, especially when we're talking about the realm of mental health. So this has happened recently. Earlier this year, Professor Moncrieff from University College London published a seminal article in Molecular Psychiatry, which calls into question the serotonin hypothesis of depression. So let's just backtrack for a little bit. It has, for a number of years, been accepted that one of the contributing factors to depression is low levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin. And based upon this, an entire class of drugs called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors has been created, and there are more and more on the market, as well as a partner drug class, norepinephrine serotonin uptake inhibitors, right? SNRIs, reuptake inhibitors rather. So this professor was interested as to the efficacy of SSRIs and whether or not depression could be distilled down to something like a specific neurochemical. Now, to be clear, nobody believes that there is one cause of depression. And the more that we unfold depression, the more we recognize that not only are individual presentations unique, but what's going on in people's bodies and their brains can be unique. So we would say there's a high level of heterogeneity. Anyway, Professor Moncrieff was really interested to look more deeply as to whether there was evidence in support of the serotonin hypothesis. And in doing so, she reviewed studies that included tens of thousands of participants. So we are talking about something very large. If you're going to overturn a pre-existing theory of mental health, you need to consider very large numbers. So these are the four variables I'm going to bring to your attention, which she discusses that undermine the likelihood that serotonin is a primary target that we should be focusing on in pharmacological interventions. So number one, she notes that for a while there had been research which was published showing that people who were depressed had lower levels of serotonin, right? And there seemed to be a cause and effect relationship. But recent research in the last 20 years with large amounts of people has in no way been able to replicate that, drawing it into question. Secondly, there have been studies, because serotonin actually comes, the precursors for it first and foremost from our diet, and we have the largest amount within the gut. So she looked at research for people who were dieting, where serotonin levels were naturally lower. And these individuals were no more vulnerable to depression than anybody else. Another thing that she discusses is that in the past, it was believed that a modification of the serotonin transporter gene was a risk factor for depression, because definitely having a modification in this gene means different levels of serotonin. But again, in investigating tens of thousands of different participants through various different research studies, she did not find that people with this genetic difference, or we would say with this phenotype, were more likely to have depression. And finally, and this one just for me is the most interesting, she found that individuals that had been on selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors for a long period of time actually had lower levels of serotonin. And she hypothesized this was because these drugs were increasing serotonin levels too high, so the body was managing it by metabolizing it at a faster rate. So what does this mean, right? First of all, it doesn't mean that the hypothesis has been overturned completely. I think it's really important we know this. And she says in the paper, it's almost impossible to overturn a negative. Like, it would be possible to say serotonin has no effect on this, But it's very difficult to say, like on a particular pathway, we can research this or what's its effect. But to say serotonin has no relationship to depression, that's complicated. Like, you have to look and look and look and look to disprove its relationship rather than saying, oh, look, it has some positive effect. We just measured this. But what is born out of this research study, and what she says at the end, is that we should no longer perceive depression as arising from some specific chemical element. That depression is a multi-tiered mental health condition, and therefore we need to be considering health interventions which are multimodal, have various different approaches. So this brings me to yoga therapy, because yoga therapy is working with perception through the yamas and niyamas. It's working with movement and exercise known to improve depression, with breathing that has an effect on the autonomic nervous system, with going inside, pratyahara, right? And that brings up the idea of mindfulness, and things that cultivate concentration, which help the mind, which may move into constant depressive thought processes to go somewhere else, so it supports attentional control, right? So this really makes an argument for yoga. And the other thing is that over the years with research, we understand that yoga elicits its antidepressant effects through a whole host of different pathways. Some of them psychological, like improving mood and reducing stress and improving connectivity with other beings, but things like increasing heart rate variability, increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is the necessary fertilizer for neuroplasticity and low in depression, that it has an effect on connectivity in the brain, and seems, through the research we already have, and it's still, in its nascent stages, that it increases the volume of brain structures associated with resiliency. So there's this twofold piece. One, yoga therapy is working on so many aspects of the person, and two, it elicits effects through so many different psychophysiological mechanisms. And so I think it just highlights to the community of psychiatry the need for such approaches. And I hope you bring this to the attention of psychiatrists who are now sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, the serotonin hypothesis of depression may not be true. What now? And lastly, I just want to note, if you are on an SSRI, just because serotonin may not be the reason that you are feeling improvement, that doesn't mean it doesn't work. So don't lose faith in something that has been helping you for years. And please, if you want to make any changes to your medication, always seek the advice of your doctor. That is absolutely essential. I'm just sharing with you a change in view and not making any recommendations for how you manage your mental health. Thank you.